What's up? I am David Long, and welcome to Why is Non-Reductionism a Better Meta-Theory? Probably first off, what I need to do is say, what is a meta-theory? A philosophical meta-theory is trying to be something like a theory of everything as it relates to philosophy. So it's a philosophical theory that includes a lot of other different theories and approaches to philosophy. So a meta-theory is going to try to incorporate the best of all philosophical ideas and do it in a way where they harmonize with each other. And also there's going to be meta-distinctions about how to deal with the interactions between these elements and how to apply diverse perspectives in a holistic way. Some of you are new to meta-theory and didn't even know that there were other meta-theories. Maybe non-reductionism is the first meta-theory that you've learned about. Others watching this might be more familiar with other meta-theories. This video in particular is more meant to address the latter group, the people who know about other meta-theories, so they can understand how non-reductionism is better, how it has upgrades and improvements, how I've learned from the lessons and the failures of other meta-theories, and how non-reductionism is going to be better. But if you've never heard of any meta-theory, I hope that this video still will give you a lot of perspective on where I'm coming from and where non-reductionism is coming from. I generally try not to assume that my viewer knows anything about anything when I talk to them, only things that we've discussed previously, and so far we haven't really discussed hardly anything. But in this video, because I'm talking to people who already might know about other meta-theories, I am going to be assuming that the viewer might know some things about meta-theory. So if you hear me using words or terminology that you don't understand, just keep listening and I'll probably explain it. If for some reason I don't explain it and there's something that you don't understand, feel free to write about it in the comments and I will message you back and let you know what I'm talking about. Okay, let's jump right into it. I'm going to break this video into 3 parts. The first part is going to be me talking about my history with meta-theory. The second part is going to be talking about pros and cons of other meta-theories like integral theory and metamodernism. And then part 3 is going to be about the upgrades that non-reductionism brings to the table. But if you don't want to hear me talk about my history with meta-theory and you want to just get straight to the pros and cons and the upgrades, you can go to this time and get straight to it. The reason I feel like I should start by talking about my own history with these things is so you can know where I'm coming from and how I've developed this non-reductionist meta-theory and where I'm getting ideas from and stuff like that. So I was born in... No, I'm just kidding. I'm not going to go that far back. Maybe I'll just start by telling you that I grew up in a really religious home. I was a Christian a little bit longer than some of the people who come out of it, into my late teens, and it took me a little bit longer to deconstruct some of those ideas. So when I did, I felt really groundless and I was dealing with a lot of existential issues. So I felt it was really important to try to study as many different religions and philosophies and worldviews as possible to try to figure out what was going on. So while I found a bunch of value in a bunch of different interesting ideas in a bunch of different worldviews and perspectives and religions, I didn't really feel like any of them were like the one true way or something that I would ascribe to. I used to say something like, I don't want to be in a box unless it says one with everything. So after a lot of thought and study, I started to come up with my own version of meta-theory. And I actually thought it was the first and only one at the time. I really wanted to start something like a mystery school for 20-somethings who had deconstructed their religion and were looking for meaning and purpose in life and self-mastery without superstition. And I really wanted to help 20-somethings who had done this existential deconstruction, people who were coming out of religious ideas or coming of age, and they really wanted to get a grounded and skillful perspective on the other side of this deconstruction. Some kind of meta-reconstruction that included a lot of the good things from a lot of different worldviews without being reductionist. I was really inspired by my study of philosophy and comparative mythology and psychology and self-mastery. This is a page from my notebook at the time. So as you can see, even back then, I had an idea of a spiraling dialectic, different stages of development, and a version of quadrants that I call divisions of 4. Now, divisions of 4 isn't exactly quadrants. I think it's a similar kind of tool. In fact, I think you could say that quadrants is basically divisions of 4 applied to ontology. And this tool wasn't invented by Ken Wilber. Other people have used it in the past, like Carl Jung used it to come up with MBTI types, and the different mental functions are basically quadrants within quadrants. Basically, divisions of 4 is just yin and yang. You have duality, which is a unity, and even within that duality, there are these little dots. So if you take that and you twist it, then you have individuals and collectives, interiors and exteriors, as it would relate to ontology. But divisions of 4 is more of like a perspective finding tool. Like you put something in the center and then you think about all the different possible relations to that thing, and also different ways that you can come into those different perspectives on the thing. So I'll talk more about that later when I teach quadrants and divisions of 4, when we dig deeper into the philosophy stuff. But I was also really inspired by Joseph Campbell and his work on comparative mythology. This actually, I think, is one of the first implicit integrative perspectives that I came across that I found really inspiring. He also has fair overarching standards as it relates to his integration of mythology and different overarching distinctions and subcategories. He basically has an integrative meta-theory as it relates to religion. So the structure for how I was going to do this mystery school had 4 different stages to it. And I was working on writing this book that I called Understanding and Control. And there were going to be 4 books, the 2 understanding books and the 2 control books. The understanding books were going to relate to the first couple stages of development, and the control books related to the next couple stages of development. Now we generally talk about these stages in the context of spiral dynamics, but I had different archetypes for each stage and different tools related to the attainment of knowledge and skill in each stage. I was using things like archetypes and symbolism, and I was kind of relating these different stages to a variation on like tarot card symbolism. So for example, at Orange, I had the Fool, and basically the archetype of the Fool is about learning rationality, learning the limits of our perspective and epistemic humility to be able to get good knowledge. And the tool that you get at this level is the sword of truth. The next level, in spiral dynamics, what we call green, or the postmodern level, the archetype is the monk or the hermit. And the tool that relates to that stage of development is the cup. So these are the 2 types of understanding: more rational, logical type of understanding, and a more poetic, metaphorical type of understanding. And the idea is to integrate and include both with skillful overarching standards. At the next levels of development, the personal integrative stage and the collective integrative stage, these are the control stages of development. For personal integration, the archetype is the magician. So this is about self-mastery and being skillful and creative. And the tool is the wand. And the last stage of development is collective integration, and the archetype is the philosopher king. The tool associated with it is the crown of wisdom. And at this stage, it's more about figuring out ways to take this knowledge and help the world with it. I first developed this system in the early 2000s and started to do some of my first classes with students and was working on writing my books. But then I discovered integral theory. And I originally thought, oh, this is better. It's less symbolic because it's grounded in developmental psychology. It probably has more academic grounding and support. It had a couple more elements, and people had been working together around this meta theory for some years, and there was already a community around it. And I thought, oh, I need to study this. And I kind of put my project on the back burner and spent some years studying integral theory because I was really interested in ways that we could change the world and create new systems together and bring the major improvements that the world is so desperately craving. I thought maybe it would save me a lot of time to work within the context of integral theory and the integral community. These people have a lot of the important distinctions that are really needed to be able to create this better world together. Instead of reinventing the wheel, I would just take up the banner and see if I can contribute and carry it further and work within the context of what's already happening. And I was pretty excited to do that. In 2012, there were Occupy integral community calls around the time of Occupy Wall Street, and it seemed like we were going to start working on some of these projects together. And I got real excited about that, and I got involved in those calls. But what I quickly found out was it was a lot of the same postmodern talking in circles, and it was like, well, we really need to get some stuff done. I think this is a good idea, and this is a good idea, and what if we did this? We could do this. Yeah, that's interesting. What do you think? And then it just got passed around in circles, and we never got anywhere. So I started my own integral group on Facebook, and I called it the Integral Community of the Adequate. And I invited a lot of people from those same calls to have our own calls, to where we were going to actually get some stuff done and get down to it. But when I started talking to these people, what I quickly realized was this is not really the community. These people are not really adequate. A lot of them are still holding on to superstitious, pre-rational worldviews. And that's going to be a big problem problem if we're trying to create some kind of a healthy version of religion in this new system. And I knew that very well from my experience learning from Joseph Campbell, that we can't be taking any of these traditional worldviews literally and thinking that we're creating something new and better, because it's going to be reductionist and biased and superstitious and divisive and unskillful. So I rebranded and created another new group called the Integral Emergentist Revolutionary Movement. And it was in particular these two distinctions that I thought were really going to set us apart and create the healthy version of the integral community that was emergentist as it relates to consciousness, getting away from the previous emphasis on consciousness as the ground of being and these Eastern idealistic creation myths, as well as a focus on a revolutionary movement. The integral community puts a lot of focus on translation into different things, like a hack into Buddhism, a hack into Christianity, a hack into capitalism or consumerism. So they would do things like integral Christianity and integral Buddhism and integral conscious capitalism and integral conscious consumerism and things like this. So all translation, no transformation. So the idea behind creating the emergentist revolutionary version of integral was to say that we are not believing in these Eastern creation myths, and we are not just doing translation, but we're also interested in transformation. Originally, when I came across Ken Wilber, one of the reasons that I felt really comfortable being in the integral community was that Wilber suggested this idea that he called the pre-trans fallacy, or the pre-trans distinction. And he explicitly said that he was influenced by Joseph Campbell, same as me. And so he made this distinction between literal, magical, mythical ideas that are pre-rational and metaphorical ideas, poetic ideas that are trans-rational.
Joseph Campbell, probably the recent era's greatest mythologer and interpretive mythology, and somebody I certainly cut my teeth on. I was a great admirer of his and a really extraordinary work that he did. He used to very, very vehemently, actually, say that there's really sort of two types of mythology, or mythology forms two different functions. He wouldn't use the terms pre-rational and trans-rational, but the way we're talking about them is the way he would talk about these two functions of mythology. And the first function is when mythology is taken to be concretely real. But what some people do, particularly educated, intelligent people like us that are trying to get some meaning in our lives, we can tend to take myths as deeply symbolic of something else. Campbell knew this, as if the capacity to form a cognition that says it's as if this is the case, it's transrational. It can represent a deeper self, a higher self. It can represent oneness with all of reality. So that's a very, very distinguishing way to tell the difference between pre-rational myths that are taken to be concretely, literally true, and trans-rational myths that may represent some very high transpersonal dimensions. And the problem, again, with the pre-trans fallacy is that people like Freud take every trans-rational as if higher mythology and reduce it to two-year-old infantile nonsense. And on the other hand, way too many people take a lot of the pre-rational stuff and elevate it to trans-rational glory it just doesn't have.
From the outside, how do you know if this person's operating at a pre-rational or trans-rational level? Would it be if they were able to say, I'm going to act as if?
Yeah. Well, first of all, you ask them exactly what is it that you're doing. If they're making an empirical claim, check it empirically. On the other hand, it can be a very high kind of metaphoric and as-if interpretive tool.
And so I felt safe in this community, like this is a community of people who understand the difference between rationality and poetry, between the cup and the sword, and who could make these skilled distinctions. What I later found out through interactions with this community and through understanding the theory more in context is that there's actually a pre-trans fallacy at the heart of integral theory. Wilber himself, as I'm saying, believes in a Eastern creationist, literal, magical, mythical worldview, where he thinks consciousness is the ground of being, and he believes in spirit through time.
Love is not just a feeling. You are actually feeling a force that stretches throughout the universe and goes all the way back to the Big Bang and the ground of all being, one's truest and deepest self, infinite, unbounded, unlimited, and driven top to bottom by love. This love is fundamentally who and what you are. This love is timeless and eternal, present from the very beginning, and fundamentally continuing to drive evolution right now. An ever-present unity that has been here from the very beginning and all along, the force that moves the sun and other stars. Here, the deepest secrets of the universe show themselves.
Absolute subjectivity is a pure self. It's vast emptiness, vast openness. And you experience this emptiness and openness because it's a space in which everything is arising right now. Fundamentally, it's waking up to this pure self. God is pure subject in you. Show me the face you had before your parents were born. That's a literal koan. That's not a symbolic thing. There's something in you right now that existed prior to your parents' birth. Before the Big Bang, I am. This I amness is pure spirit and is the fundamental creatrix of everything that's arising. Pure awareness, pure self, your true self, is the space in which all of this is arising.
And it actually shows up in relation to most of the elements in his version of meta theory. For example, he has stacked Aurobindo's state stages on top of developmental psychology, on top of spiral dynamics, and corrupted the developmental model, basically implying that these mystical religious believers are actually at the highest stages of development. Wilber believes in reincarnation, and he even believes that people who are at higher stages of development are able to get there because of virtues from their past life. And he frames all of development in this way of talking about it like spirit moving through time. Very Hegelian. My perspective and spiral dynamics is actually more in line with dialectical materialism, which, by the way, is a very different thing from reductionist materialism or empirical reductionism. Obviously, ontologically, we take into account all four quadrants. It's just that we don't think that the interior quadrants go all the way down and back. We know from science that consciousness is a later historical emergent, and subjectivity is an epiphenomenon of the brain. There's also a problem with an overemphasis on state training, and even the states themselves are framed in terms of a Buddhist worldview. Like the waking state is called gross, and the deep sleep state is called causal. So the idea here being that consciousness is more fundamental, and the regular waking world is like just the base level, the gross level of things, that if you really see past it, you'll get more to like the causal, more fundamental, more real things, which are this pure consciousness and stuff. So basically, what I'm saying is every element of integral theory has been corrupted by literal fundamentalist religious belief of the Eastern variety. But I digress. I don't want to talk too much about that because we'll get into it more later when we start talking about the pros and cons of integral theory. In 2013, I moved to Vermont, and back in the day, there used to be a bunch of different Facebook groups called like Emerging Integral this state and that state. And so I went on to Emerging Integral Vermont, and I made a post and I was like, I want to start a local integral meetup. Who's interested? Who wants to get involved in this with me? And local integralists messaged back and we started a group. And this is actually where I originally started to learn and practice certain versions of integral governance systems, tension processing, and different ways of decision-making processes that go beyond the top-down legislation of taste or the bottom-up might makes right style of decision-making. And I think that's very helpful and very important stuff. I also started getting involved more in the community online and writing articles. One of the articles that I wrote was about integral politics, and Don Beck read it and actually reached out to me and gave me some compliments and started to send me some of his books and talk to me about some of the problems that he was having with Wilber. Also, in the comments of that same note, Daniel Gortz, the later developer of Metamodernism, also liked my article and posted the index for what would later become one of the early books of Metamodernism also in the comments of that integral politics article. For me, that's kind of like a historical comment section. In 2014, about 10 years ago, I started making some of my first integral videos. And at the time, I was teaching lots of people integral theory. Even then, I was teaching a fixed or improved, more healthy version of integral theory, and really wishing there was something I could point them to. I was giving the same lessons to individuals over and over again. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to make some videos about some of this stuff. And I was largely motivated by the fact that there wasn't really any good intro material. All the intro material was kept behind a paywall. And even then, it wasn't really very good. The Integral Life website was basically just a bunch of famous people talking to Ken Wilber and being convinced of integral ideas. There wasn't really good intro material. I also started making some videos that were critical of some of Ken Wilber's ideas. And I was even starting to offer some small upgrades. In 2017, Metamodernism and the Listening Society came out, which was one of the first diverging movements pushing away from the integral brand and the integral community. Later, I had an interview with Daniel Gortz, and he told me the motivation behind this was to secularize and politicize. And I think those are really good motivations and good ideas. At the time, I was still very invested in the integral banner. In 2018, I came out with a video making a distinction between Davidian and Wilberian integral, and I introduced my own Davidian integral map. It included some upgrades in relation to quadratic primacy. It had a focus on emergentism, and we took away the mystical corruption in the stages of development, which is one of the reasons why Don Beck really liked me and wanted to work with me, because he thought I was going to restore integrity in the meta theory community to spiral dynamics, his life work. We tried several times to be able to meet up in person. For a while, I was living in Texas like him, but unfortunately, we were never able to make that happen before he died. Although, like I said, he did send me all of his books, and he would reach out to me from time to time complaining about Wilber. One time I even asked him on his page what he thought about third tier and Aurobindo state stages, and he basically accused Wilber of not really knowing what the higher stages of integration were really about, not really representing them himself. And he challenged Wilber to a debate and said that he didn't think that Wilber would ever debate him because he just hides out in his loft in Denver and avoids all of his critics. By the way, I think literally every public debate that has happened in the integral community has included me. One time I even debated 2 integral professors at once. In 2020, we rebranded as Integral 2.0. We made our list of grievances and ideas for refinement very clear, and we got support from lots of people in the community sending in their I'm upgrading to Integral 2.0 videos that were tacked on to the end of that Integral 2.0 announcement video.
Hello there, this is Daniel Gortz, Metamodernism.
Joe Lightfoot.
Yosha Kutnak, you know me as a co-host at Integral Review.
Julian Walker.
My name is Bernardo Marzaldi.
I'm Joe Camosi.
I'm Layman Pascal.
This is Armando Davila.
My name is Troy Wiley, and I'm with Hack Humanity.
I'm Robert Stram, World Summit and Hack Humanity.
David Hartful Jr. from Black Leader Analysis.
Alexander Jenkins, I'm a psychotherapist.
I'm Tony Holmes, the Love Warrior.
My name is Luke. I am also known as Luke.
My name is Dissa.
My name is Hunter.
Mickey O'Brien.
This is Manifesto.
This is Big Joe.
Bill Kaufman.
Michael Slade.
My name is Tamika.
This is Prabhu.
I'm Kai.
Hey, it's Joe Ludford.
My name is Nicole.
This is Paul Goddard.
I'm upgrading to Integral 2.0.
I am 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 upgrading to Integral 2.0.
I'm upgrading to Integral 2.0.
I'm upgrading to Integral 2.0.
I'm upgrading to Integral 2.0.
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 2.0.
2.0. 2.0.
2.0. Time to upgrade.
I was down with the Integral 2.0 at the very beginning.
Again, there was an emphasis on transformation and refinement to the theory. I introduced nested quadratic holons, which also relates to primacy, a new distinction about height and vastness, and I started doing spiral wizard training. So around this time, I also teamed up with a friend and started a video production company, which started taking a lot more of my time. In 2021, I introduced an upgrade to epistemology, throwing out the old integral methodological pluralism, which had multiple problems, and introduced 4P4Z, which is much better. It was around this time that I also had more ideas about upgrades that I wanted to introduce. I started working on the new Integral 2.0 map. I was working on a book called The Long View, which was a handbook for an integral revolutionary movement to try to work together to birth the new integral age. And I ended up canceling all of these projects and quitting the integral community. Basically, many people in my community were getting very tired of me and themselves bumping their head up against the wall of having to try to deal with the integral community, and they were encouraging me to start my own thing and to start fresh and to create something that was healthy so I could spend more of my time working on building something healthy and productive versus constantly having to argue with all of these religious believer people who just didn't want to get it, who just didn't want to grow up. And even though I had spent a decade in this community, I was eventually convinced. And in late 2024, here very recently, I introduced non-reductionism, a new element called modes, levels of quadratic zoom, the non-reductionist map, and of course I have a lot of ideas for upgrades to the map, upgrades to the community, and how we can apply these ideas better in our own personal lives and at scale in culture and to serve the world. But I'll get into that deeper after we talk more about the pros and cons of integral theory and metamodernism. I should also mention that since launching non-reductionism, I made all my past videos unlisted, but I do have them archived. You can subscribe to my other personal I Am David Long YouTube channel. You can search through the playlists playlists and find my old videos, and I'll still probably be posting some new videos there too. Vlogs and maybe some other stuff that I don't feel like necessarily goes on the Non-Reductionist channel. I'll share a link in description, and I'll also put a link at the end of the video. Okay, let's talk pros and cons. First we'll do integral theory, and then we'll do metamodernism. Integral theory, pros. You have the AQAL elements. All quadrants, all levels, all lines, all states, all types. Pretty good start for a holistic approach. You have an explicit map, the whole worldview expressed in one page, one basic image, which is a good start for really being able to dig into the meta theory, and it gives people something to reference back to. I think that's a really good thing, and I think it's really important and helpful. Another really good thing is the fact that developmental psychology is scientific, and stages are rooted in a meta-analysis of developmental psychology, at least up to a point. There's some good academic and scientific grounding and rational language. Ken Wilber is a founder, so there is some kind of a person who is the origin of the theory who we can point to as a person of authority. That has its issues too, but we'll get to that later. Also, there's the idea of depth and span, or horizontal and vertical development. So often in the past, so many different people just pointed to horizontal development or vertical development, and it's very rare that you see somebody who's talking about both. Also, of course, there's the pre-trans distinction. Pre-trans rational, pre-trans egoic, pre-trans conventional. Again, there's some problems with this, but this is a really helpful distinction. There's some certain parts of the theory that could be reframed, such as eros and agape, maybe if they weren't concepts specifically tied to the idea that love goes all the way down and all the way back, but just masculine and feminine aspects of love. Fine, great. Also, non-duality. If we're talking about including both absolute and relative truth and holding them both at the same time, as long as we're not making unfounded claims about the absolute. Like if we're talking about absolute unity and interconnectedness as well as relative distinctions, fine, great, good. Now, when it comes to the cons, of course, I've already mentioned, there's a bias conflationary integration that privileges Eastern religious ideas, and also the upper left quadrant and state training. Most of the problems come back to this one problem. It's even hard to tease them all apart because they're all so interconnected. This bias ends up corrupting every element, and it also ends up breaking its own rules when it comes to integration. So you have a religious cosmology at the heart of this theory. Wilber believes in free will and souls and reincarnation. Wilber believes in psychics.
Meta-analyses of precognition, telepathy, and so on have shown almost 100% certainty that they exist. I think it's really only as those that were crazy enough to believe in it really started doing research on these areas, and we got some real data that those who are actually data-oriented or evidence-oriented, if they looked at it, they tended to believe it. And I've seen a lot of people's responses that, no, I think it's really there. So that's why all of these psychic events of subtle paranormal phenomena were called paranormal. Normal people don't have precognition or clairvoyance.
There's a lot of woo-woo ideas in the community. Wilber ends up endorsing minority positions in the scientific community, even some creationist ideas as it relates to evolution. Aurobindo is where the word integral comes from. There's a problem of acting like they're doing some kind of a real meta-analysis when they're mixing in the mystic Aurobindo with developmental psychology. There's also a corruption of the colors, negating the dialectic that was built into it through spiral dynamics. Wilber kind of moved over to this sort of light spectrum way of talking about stages where blue is called amber and yellow is called teal. And he stacks on third tier Aurobindo state stages as if being a mystic is the highest stages of development. And there's all kinds of problems with that. Previous versions of the map were calling third tier stages psychic. And they're also saying things like construct awareness and ego awareness aren't things that happen until third tier, when really they can happen at much earlier stages like green. And so you have people who are construct aware and ego aware still in late first tier stages thinking that they're at the highest stages of development. It's a real problem. And of course there's a very Buddhist take on the states where the body and the material world are considered gross, and the deep sleep or pure consciousness, empty consciousness like nirvikalpa samadhi are related with the causal, or like true self, things like that, as if like your true self is pure consciousness. Of course, this whole favoring of Eastern religious worldviews is qualifying the unqualifiable. It's looking in the wrong quadrant for data. It's a pre-trans fallacy. He talks about deep science as a way to justify this religious belief, where he tries to disqualify people who think otherwise about these things, basically saying that you aren't qualified to judge unless you yourself have had these experiences. But he'll also disqualify people who have had these experiences, who don't agree with the interpretations of those experiences. So basically, if you don't agree with him, you're wrong. And of course, there are people who have gotten into these states who don't agree with this translation. And let's be real, I don't have to do something like go to church and have a worship experience to understand why Christianity is wrong. Just like one wouldn't also have to get into a special state to know that the logic and the translation around what it means to be in that state isn't valid. And unfortunately, at the end of the day, a lot of the people in these spaces, including Wilber himself, kind of just use the idea of this hierarchy to feel special personally. They say that the reason they're at these high stages is because they've done work in their past lives and they reincarnated in a way that allowed them to develop faster than others. So not only are they more mature in this lifetime, but they're more mature than other people across many lifetimes. So not only do these people think that they're smarter than other people now, they think that there's nothing that these people could even do in this lifetime that would make them smart and wise and mature.
There's really only two things that you carry with you from life to life. And one is the repository of your virtue, and the other is the repository of your wisdom. Wisdom in Buddhism is defined in one way, your capacity to understand emptiness. And virtue is defined as your capacity to do good works, ethics. And it also explains one of the most difficult things that developmental psychologists face. We have no idea why people transform. Anybody who's a parent has 3 children knows that they come with souls, and they are 80% formed. And you treat them all the same, and you've got a doctor, a bank robber, and a serial murderer. And the easiest way is to just say reincarnation. They come with this repository. If you reached turquoise in your previous lifetime, you are going to hit the ground running and get to turquoise as early as you possibly can and then start from there. Let's say if last time in your life you got up to magic, then this time you're born, you're going to go through those stages fairly quickly without any problem, and then your challenge will be to move into mythic and rational structures. So that's what would happen in your adult life, is you would settle into the next level or wave that you're to work on and kind of stick with that for a while.
And I think it does take a mind predisposed. I think you have to be almost born with a desire to do that, because otherwise you won't care. And we simply, for whatever reason, we're one of the kooky, far out people that are plugged in to that central drive of the cosmos.
This is some next level elitism. And it really shoots the developmental project in the foot. This is also why they're not really that interested in transformation, that they're more talking about translation, because it's a condescending approach to development. Well, I'll speak to people on their level, but will they ever be able to really understand me on my level? Probably not. So all translation, no transformation. One time I even heard someone ask Ken Wilber, why should we care?
Why should we care? If you're in a dream at night and there are thousands of people starving, there are 2 ways you can stop their hunger. One is in the dream you can try to feed them all, or the second is you can wake up, and that will end their suffering immediately.
Now, you can probably understand why this is a terrible answer, because it's basically acting as if other people's suffering isn't real. And I can just wake up personally, be enlightened myself, and then I don't have to care about other people's suffering. This is not wisdom. This is a shameful answer. And it really explains why he only writes these books. He brags about the fact that he never shows up, even though showing up is one of the 4 ways to be healthy in each quadrant. There's showing up, growing up, waking up, and cleaning up. But he doesn't show up.
You want to not only grow up and wake up and clean up, but if you want to show up for reality. I myself never attended a single integral conference, and I never got on a chat room or a discussion board.
He doesn't show up in the online forums. He doesn't show up at any of the integral conferences. He doesn't show up for debates. Imagine if you were the founder of a philosophical community and never showed up in any of your online forums, and there were conferences in the name of your brand of philosophy, but you made a virtue of the fact that you never show up to them. Isn't that crazy? Here's a philosopher who's never been in a public debate. That's crazy. I've been in lots of debates. So, of course, there's no leadership, there's no goals, there's no big picture plan. It's a pat yourself on the back and feel special for thinking that you're at the highest stages of development type of community. It's basically turned into a Ken Wilber cult of personality. He's surrounded himself by yes men. He never debates, he never addresses his critics. And you can see in some of the videos that I've made, or the Integral World site that Frank Visser made, or a note that Ken Wilber made about his critics, the ERPI episode that's pretty well known in the integral community. There is no room for criticism. Anytime anyone criticizes or offers upgrades, there is a very cult-like response, like, who do you think you are? How dare you? How dare you question Ken Wilber? You think you're as wise as him? Even in that Wyatt Earp note, Wilber says that when you're the Wyatt Earp of philosophy, every punk with a pea shooter wants to come and try you. The pioneer is the one with all the arrows in his back. As if anybody who criticizes is just coming for the throne. There's a bunch of smart people who learned integral theory, who read all these books, who learned as much as they could from Wilber, and this is how they get treated when they bring their critical feedback or their ideas for upgrades. They get told, sit down and shut up, who do you think you are? And let's be real, there's a lot of smart people who have a lot of different perspectives, coming from a lot of different areas of expertise, and I'm sure that many of them have valuable criticisms and ideas to bring to the table. Integral is supposed to be the best at processing tensions, but that's not what we see at all. They don't apply these integral governance methods to be able to integrate in the best into their meta theory and continue to upgrade it. Not at all. And so integral theory has become a type of dogma. Even though he's kind of the first word on meta theory, his arrogance, calling himself the Einstein of consciousness, and refusing to engage, it's ultimately why meta theory will grow beyond him. And this is why I won't speak about him as a figure worthy of respect. And his policy of actively ignoring all of his critics makes me want to not acknowledge him or the integral brand, especially not with any enthusiasm or positivity moving forward. In fact, I'll try not to mention them after this video. The information is out there, and this video is here. All my past videos are still available, so let's call it good enough and move forward. So Ken Wilber's overly sensitive. He doesn't do debates. There's no processing of criticism within his community. There's no upgrades to his theory that don't come from him. That's a problem. Again, that's why it's dogmatic. The last version of the integral map is 18 years old. There haven't been any improvements made on it since 2007. It's excessively colorful and a little bit overly simplistic. Another problem is that in a lot of ways, integral theory kind of just ends up being a classification game. Well, this goes in this quadrant and that goes in that quadrant. But there's no prioritization. And they even talk about just giving equal emphasis to all quadrants. But if I'm trying to solve a problem and I get data from all of these different categories, well, what is the most important data? What data from what category trumps the other data? Integral methodological pluralism doesn't really work, and most people don't know how to use it. Another problem is this emphasis on the upper left quadrant. It's not just embedded in the theory. There's also not really good, healthy manifestations as it relates to the other quadrants in practicality either. There's not really any action in the world, there's not a healthy community, and there are no structures or plans or goals about what we're trying to do with any of these things. Really, the only goal is feel smart and live a more healthy, holistic life for yourself. Integral life is basically just a self-help business with some yes men talking heads who repeat things that Wilber has already said. In fact, for years, Ken Wilber has just been teaching the same ideas over and over and over again. At a certain point, it's redundant to even listen to him because he won't say anything new. Even though they've had a YouTube channel for something like 20 years, they have tons of guests on there, and Ken Wilber himself is on there. Their YouTube channel only has something like 20,000 subscribers. And in the last 5 years, I think their biggest video in terms of views is just one where Ken Wilber starts wearing a wig. That one got some thousands of views, but most of their other videos only get like 500 views. My last video that I put out after taking some years off on a channel that has just under 2,000 subscribers got 1,000 views in just a couple days. Imagine if I had 20,000 subscribers. All of the integral groups that you're going to find online are integral in name alone. And unfortunately, in these groups, you can even find some pretty terrible ideas being spread around. People supporting Trump, people making sexist and racist comments, and these people aren't even kicked out of the group. There's also no healthy standards for leadership or who's allowed to be in the group. For a long time, the main audience for integral ideas has been postmodernists and New Agers and Buddhists. So the community is basically filled with these kinds of people. In these communities, what you'll really find are not really people who even know meta theory. Most of them are just smart-sounding New Agers. And to the extent that they will reference meta theory, it will just be meta theory in service of some postmodern idea. Ken Wilber used to say things like, if you're hearing the sound of my voice right now, it's because you're already at these stages. Otherwise, you wouldn't be interested in this content. And he would say things like, everybody's right. All worldviews have a piece of the truth, and nobody's smart enough to be wrong all the time, to appeal to postmodernists. But it's also true to say all of these worldviews are wrong. They're all limited and reductionist, and they all think that they're the one true way when they're not. There are pieces of truth to be integrated from all of them, but if you're a believer in any of these particular worldviews, you have a partial, limited, and reductionist view. So this is just selling integral ideas to green people. And why would you do that? Well, you would do that if you have a business. You would do that if the goal is to sell books and to sell things. Otherwise, ideally what you should do is that you should find people who are already at this level, people who are already making implicit integral distinctions, and give them a meta map. That's a developmentally appropriate thing to do. It's actually dangerous and unskillful to give, in particular, stages of development as an idea to people at lower levels of development, because they will use these ideas in a violent and unskillful way. Less of a problem with things like quadrants, but in particular, stages is not something that you want to teach to people in first tier. Most of the good and smart people who actually care about these ideas don't engage in the online groups and eventually leave the community and leave integral behind. Kind of being like, yeah, it was helpful to learn some of those maps and some of those ideas, but I really don't want to be associated with the community. I'll take some of these ideas and go now. That's kind of the general way that most people engage with integral. There have also been problems where Wilber ends up endorsing gurus or spiritual teachers that have alleged abuse and even alleged PDF files who have sexual allegations against them. Don't at me. You can look it up. It's all very much on the record. All in all, integral is a pretty embarrassing thing to be associated with. And that's why there have been offshoot movements like Metamodernism and now Non-Reductionism, who want to secularize and distance themselves from the integral brand and associations with Ken Wilber and this community. It seems to me that integral is fizzling and failing. There used to be emerging meetups. There used to be conferences. There used to be a community center. There used to be integral things happening and going on. All of these projects have fizzled and failed. The community center closed. There's no meetups. Integral Institute, which was supposed to be some kind of a think tank for integral, that also failed. They were trying to have integral courses and integral accreditation at colleges, and most of those colleges have closed and or stopped teaching integral theory. There are still a couple online type colleges or woo-woo colleges that will offer degrees in integral theory, but those colleges also are studying subtle energy healing or offering degrees in modern shamanism and extraterrestrial studies and how to communicate with animals and psychedelic healing and things like that. So, like I said, these are the kind of new age woo-woo type things that integral has sadly been associated with. And like I said, there isn't really good intro material anywhere. There are some courses, but they're all behind paywalls. This is why people like me had to start making intro material on YouTube, because it didn't exist. And of course, lots of people have been very critical of the very expensive courses and events that used to happen but are not really available anymore. There's nothing going on. It's basically over. I personally learned a lot from both the pros and cons of being in the integral community for some years. I learned a lot of good things that I would want to keep and incorporate, and a lot of the ways that it can fail and go wrong, and how to avoid some of those problems. So I'm very grateful for my time as a member of the integral community. So I'm sure some people who are watching this are going to have some kind of criticism of these pros and cons lists. What I would encourage you to do is make your criticisms and make your own pros and cons list in the comments. You can do it for both integral and metamodern if you like, but I'm going to move on to the pros and cons of metamodernism. Now, I have much less to say about metamodernism because metamodernism is only like 5 years old. But let's start with the pros. As I said before, metamodernism pushed away from the integral brand and wanted to both secularize and politicize. And it's not a cult of personality. They're also participatory. A lot of people are engaging in it and publishing under the banner of metamodernism, and people have things to say about it. It's also currently active. There's a little bit of excitement around it still, probably because it's still kind of new. I was even told by one of the authors when I was having a talk with him that metamodernism was able to influence a political party in Denmark. So that's all good. Now let's talk about the cons. I think one of the biggest cons is that there are unclear standards. You see, the title Metamodernism actually already existed before this new project was rebranded with that name. I think the reason that they chose Metamodernism was because people were talking about the development of a particular particular style of art, postmodern art, talking about how postmodern art is cynical and sarcastic, and there's this new emerging style of art that has an authentic irony and a new kind of sincerity, but a more mature and nuanced kind of sincerity, not like a naive sincerity. And so the authors of Metamodernism thought this kind of aligned with what they were doing, and Metamodernism is a way of talking about this postmodern stage in the line of art or movies or something like that. So the problem here is that because there are different authors publishing under the title Metamodern, what it means to be metamodern is actually not clear.
There's no strong authorial voice who's reading, understanding, and synthesizing the different metamodernist arguments and taking a stand on the fact that they are complementary and that circulation between them ultimately reveals a common intuition, a common problem, and a common set of philosophical solutions.
Oftentimes, metamodernism is spoken about from a given strand or a given perspective or a given particular school of thought or thinker.
There's a lot of these islands of metamodernism where people are taking a stand and often being critical or confrontational with the other metamodernisms.
It is very much insular, siloed approach, like, oh, there's this metamodernism and all those other ones are false and wrong.
When you go into these metamodern groups, you actually end up seeing a lot of the same problems as in the integral groups. Unfortunately, these metamodern groups are, again, just smart-sounding postmodernists. It's slightly different. There's a little bit less like Buddhist New Age woo-woo, but there still is a lot of postmodern extreme relativism.
There's some controversy over the idea of developmental stages in general, both in terms of whether it applies as a valid explanatory tool, but also in terms of whether it's good pragmatic PR from metamodern ethos that's trying to attract sensitive souls growing beyond postmodernism. Should we be cautious about foregrounding developmental models, or is that hesitation merely the result of people being cowards?
The word development, I'm not using that one as much. You can frame very similar ideas using slightly different language in a way that actually be more amenable to people, more comfortable. The reticence to adopt developmental framings is this reaction to one of the key emphases of postmodernism was this rejection that totalizing absolutistic notions of development and progress, capital P, that the modernists were up to. You're going to be making one small step. When you frame it that way, that's much more amenable to postmodern thinkers who are very skeptical of capital P progress, who would say like, okay, maybe I could accept some notion of infinitesimal progress. But at the same time, you're still acknowledging that there's something like progress at work. That's a lot of the sorts of gestures that are underway in this metamodern engagement with like postmodern and modern ideas.
The metaphor of a higher level of perspective is attractive and off-putting, and I think equal amounts. But there certainly seems to be an incongruity that can become apparent to us at the heart of the postmodern. There's a performative incongruity there, that you can't say everything is relative and that egalitarianism is a superior moral position without saying you have a higher perspective and a superior moral position. So there's a failure to take their own position seriously. And if they do take it seriously, it implies that they are near the leading edge of a progressive movement. What do you think is the validity of metamodernism specifying functional versus dysfunctional examples of other cultural codes?
The integral discourse and the metamodern discourse are both talking about forms of postmodernism. The meaningful difference in the metamodern discourse as being a bit less apt to go there. The use of terms like better, worse, or functional, dysfunctional, because the cultural studies folks will look at a move from postmodernism to modernism. There's no normative or axiological element there at all. It's just, oh, you used to like grunge music and Nirvana, and now you like Punch Brothers.
There is a need to get more clear about the tools necessary to distinguish what's actually postmodern. Going postmodern on postmodernism revives normativity, but we're not necessarily being totalistic in our application of that normativity. But since we discovered it, we should be able to normatively use it to evaluate other things. Otherwise, aren't we just being postmodern about this? That's a yet to be clarified frontier in this discourse.
A lot of metamodern theorizing is still happening from a more postmodern sensibility. Hansi Freinach's work, arguably, is not just talking about metamodernism, it's trying to do metamodern philosophy in a metamodern register. So I do think that a big reason why the whole developmental framing is so anathema to some metamodern theorists is precisely because of this issue of normativity. I think that the academy is still obviously thoroughly postmodern. And so if you're trying to do academic work on the topic of metamodernism, you don't want to touch normativity. I would say that the normative aspect is really crucial. And I do think it is an important adjudicating aspect for determining what theories really are metamodern. But I've seen ideas coming out of the quote unquote metamodern scene that I would say aren't metamodern at all.
The phrase I'm hearing that I think might lead to future clarity on this subject is in a metamodern register.
It's like a more philosophical postmodernism with some few integrative distinctions online. But it really only goes up to personal integration. In fact, there's some strong pushback against collective integration, the idea of death to turquoise. Why? Because they feel like there has to be a society at this level for this level to exist. Although I don't think that really works because there's not really a society or a culture at the postmodern level either. So there's unclear standards, no real authority on the topic, different authors with different things to say. I would try to bring up the fact that I knew some of the founders and I would talk about what their intentions are, and they would be like, yeah, but they're not the authority on what metamodernism is. This other person also wrote about metamodernism too. So there's a diversity of ideas in metamodernism. It's like, okay. And they don't have a map like Integral. So there's not like a clear chart that you can point back to and you can tell people, hey, check your map. And if you go into metamodern groups, they don't know the theory. They don't know meta theory. They've actually lost ground. They've lost authority. They've lost the maps. They've lost the theory. They've lost all ideas about what metamodernism really even means. They have some very loose ideas about it. And so again, you have a meta theory group that is metamodern in name alone. And there's nothing to appeal to. There's no standards for leadership, they don't have healthy communities, and it's all translation based. There's no idea about how we can work together to create transformative new systems. The best they've done so far is to influence the current political systems, which is good, better than nothing, but I think we can do better. I was even challenged to a debate by one of the leaders of these metamodern groups, and he was completely unqualified to be a leader in this space. Not only was he himself toxic in his behavior as a leader, but he was saying that whole elements of the theory are racist, like talking about stages are racist. I was telling him that he's not qualified to be a leader in this space because he doesn't know the theory, and then he started calling me racist. And when the moderator asked if he was even interested in learning the theory, he said no. So this is a problem. It's just one proof that there's no standard for leadership in these places, no real idea of what it really means to be metamodern. They have no idea about the theory, and many of them aren't even interested to learn it. So again, if you think I'm missing anything in terms of pros and cons, or you want to comment about any of this, feel free to do so in the comments below. I'm sure that a lot of what I'm saying here is potentially very controversial to people who are in the integral or metamodernism community who don't like what I'm saying in terms of these criticisms. Go ahead and post about it below. And for the record, I really like Daniel Gortz, one of the co-authors of the Metamodernist books. He's even smarter than what these books show. He's always been supportive of me, and I think he would make a great founder or leader of metamodernism. He's a really smart and cool guy. If you're watching, Daniel, I hope you're doing well, man. Big up. I also like a lot of people in the integral space. My criticisms here are more just criticisms of these movements and communities at large. I hope if you're a member of these communities that you won't feel personally attacked by these criticisms. And obviously, one of the reasons I'm making this video is because I'm hoping that you're open to the possibility that non-reductionism can do better. I want it to do better. I have ideas for how we can fix a lot of these problems and do better, which is exactly what I'm about to get into, the upgrades that non-reductionism brings to the table. So I'm seeing some of the comments in my last video saying something like, oh, how can you just take Integral or Ken Wilber's work, add a little bit to it, and then say it's your own? Well, first of all, I'm not taking credit for all of these things. I didn't come up with all these elements myself. And let's be real, neither did Ken Wilber. In fact, one of the big criticisms of Ken Wilber when he came out with Integral was that he didn't come up with any of those things, that he was just taking a bunch of other people's work and packaging it together and selling it as his own. The word integral comes from integral yoga and Aurobindo, and that's where also the state stages and the words gross, subtle, causal, and non-dual as it relates to states comes from. The stages are generally taken from spiral dynamics and the work of Claire Graves and Don Beck. The lines of development come from developmental psychology, and obviously types already existed. The only thing that Wilber really contributed in this mix is the idea of quadrants and some distinctions about the interplay between some of these elements. These are meta theories. So by nature, what we're doing is collecting up all the different work and telling you how you can incorporate it. And non-reductionism isn't just integral theory plus modes. It might look like that when you see, oh, it's a lot of the same elements and there's also a map. But those are probably the main two things that we have in common. Pizza and pasta might have the same ingredients, but they're not the same dish. What makes all the difference in the world is how you're using those ingredients and what you do with them and what you create with them. And one of my criticisms of integral is that that Integral knows a lot of the ingredients, but they don't have the recipe. It's not enough to just put a bunch of ingredients on the table and say, now you can cook. No, if you want to cook, you have to know how to use the ingredients. Knowing what the ingredients to make a cake are is not the same as knowing how to make a cake. So there's a bunch of important distinctions that have to happen beyond just pointing out what the ingredients are. Get past the categorization game and talk about the recipes. Chefs are not people who just list ingredients. Chefs get credit when they invent recipes. Big difference. And what did Wilber come up with? Quadrants? Well, earlier in this video, we already talked about how divisions of 4 already existed, and basically we're just applying something like yin and yang to ontology. So, I mean, yeah, we can give him at least partial credit for that. Did Wilber come up with the pre-trans fallacy? Well, kinda. He says that he is basically saying the same thing as Joseph Campbell, and he doesn't really follow that rule himself. So what's really the value of coming up with a distinction if you don't also apply it yourself? And he often does confuse and conflate pre-trans rational and pre-trans egoic. Some people have also suggested that it might be better to call trans-rational post-formal because there's a lot of confusion in the community about what trans-rational even means. A lot of people will use the word trans-rational while they're committing pre-trans fallacy number 2. On the topic of putting things on the table that nobody really uses or even understands in the community, integral methodological pluralism. We could say that Wilber came up with that, but it's not really good and nobody understands it or uses it really. And again, it's just kind of another bad categorization game. The Wilber-Combs matrix. Yeah, that's good. Understanding the relationship between states and stages, I think that's pretty helpful. In that same kind of vein, we have depth and span. That's also a pretty useful distinction. Maybe there's a couple more as well. So Wilber came up with some stuff, but if we're being honest, I've come up with just as much stuff as Wilber has, and we're about to look at a lot of it. As I've also said, Wilber's project of integration is conflationary and reductionist and biased, so it's not really good integration. Non-reductionism, on the other hand, has fair overarching standards. It doesn't break its own rules in terms of integration based on personal bias. And I think we'll see in the future that 4P4Z, the version of the new non-reductionist epistemology that I came up with, will actually be used by a lot of people, probably a lot of professional people, whereas I don't know anybody who uses integral methodological pluralism. So upgrades that non-reductionism brings to the table. Again, moving away from the classification game into the realm of practical action. Not just talking about what's, but talking about what's and how. Moving away from just the realm of understanding or a green flatland into the realm of practical action and engagement. Again, an emphasis on overarching standards and healthy non-bias integration. There's going to be both theoretical and structural upgrades, and an emphasis on maintaining integrity. There's also an inherent understanding of epistemic humility, an openness to criticism, refinement, debates, and upgrades, and a process to make that possible. It's going to be very important that we create a good community with healthy leadership. There's going to be an extra emphasis placed on self-mastery and becoming practices, not just state training practices. We also want to work together to create transformative new systems with an emphasis on mission and purpose, not just for individuals, but for humanity as a whole. This includes a focus on new religious and governance systems, like sacred naturalism and collective individualism. As I've already said, when it comes to the theory, there's a focus on non-bias integration. When it comes to the quadrants, it's not just equal emphasis to all 4 quadrants, but an understanding of primacy. There's going to be all new models, including nested quadratic holarchies. And surprisingly, in all of my study of philosophy for years, I've never heard anybody talk about philosophical primacy, the understanding that you have to do the philosophical projects in a particular order so that way they all harmonize with each other. Usually you just get thrown into the deep end of philosophy and grab things and pull them together, which doesn't make for very good integration. Instead, you actually have to do the philosophical projects in the correct order so that way they all harmonize with each other as our philosophical worldviews are developed. What we often see is that that people will favor a particular philosophical project, and the conclusions that they come to in relation to that project end up sabotaging the other philosophical project and creating a bias and unhealthy philosophical worldview. So this results in a rational cosmology and ontology, an understanding of emergentism as it relates to consciousness. I also advocate for sacred naturalism, which is a this-worldly, non-supernatural, non-superstitious, non-divisive approach to healthy religious integration. Non-reductionism also includes a healthy understanding of the pre-trans fallacy and pre-trans distinctions. Also, when it comes to quadrants, there's an understanding of quadratic zoom, or quadrants within quadrants, and understandings of levels of scale. When I was talking to Daniel Gortz, he actually mentioned the idea of quadratic zoom, and I was like, oh, you mean quadrants within quadrants? So he knows about that, but he's never written about it, and I think I'm the only person to really introduce maps that have quadrants within quadrants within quadrants. And basically, when you do quadrants within quadrants, you get a much more holistic and nuanced understanding of what that practice actually is. There's also going to be new distinctions as it relates to understanding different levels of scale. Sometimes people will think that they're taking a 4-quadrant perspective on a thing, but they end up actually finding solutions within one quadrant while thinking that they're covering another quadrant. So for example, when Wilber talks about the 3 S's of an integral spiritual practice, he mentions shadow work as if that covers the lower left quadrant, when really that's only a lower left practice within the upper left. And there's actually other important practices that relate to the lower left when it comes to spirituality, like acts of service. Non-reductionism also includes a healthy understanding of stages of development with no mystical bias, restoring integrity back to the spiral dynamics map. We're also making the distinction between implicit and explicit versions of personal integration more clear. This is a nuance that more knowledgeable members of the community have been talking about for a long time, but there hasn't really been shared or consistent terminology around it until now. Our new non-reductionist map includes 15 different developmental lines from different developmental psychologists, which serves to give us the most complete meta-analysis of lines of development ever. I also have some new interesting takes on lines of development that I don't think you've heard before. Of course, I'll get into that a little bit later once we talk more about the theory. A rational, healthy understanding of states. Non-reductionism also includes modes and roles and the self-mastery practice. As it relates to development, we also include ideas about height versus vastness, which has to do with how much knowledge one really has at each stage of development. A lot of times what happens is that people develop cognitively through stages of development quickly, and maybe they didn't spend enough time at particular stages, and they might need to go back and get more in touch with values and lessons and information to have a more full, healthy, and complete integration and personal development. When it comes to free will versus determinism, we have a view called semantic compatibilism, which is the understanding that first-person ways of talking about our experience and third-person ways of talking about our experience are not semantically compatible. I call it semantic compatibilism because compatibilism is a middle position between free will and determinism. But my friend Alyosha, what's up Alyosha? Hope you're doing well. He wrote a book about free will and determinism, and he likes to call it semantic incompatibilism for the same reason. Of course, from a more rational perspective, we understand that nature and nurture are both deterministic, and there's no such thing as free will. There's a heavily conditioned will, which isn't to say that one can't have any will. And of course, there's the difference between determinism and fatalism. This is a topic for a video in itself, but there's a much more nuanced perspective here than we have previously gotten from integral theory. When it comes to the project of creating new systems for humanity, we have collective individualism, new governance systems, and we'll also come out with a handbook for a revolutionary movement that has a plan to get us from where we are currently to where we'd like to go. So not just criticisms of the past system and ideas about where we'd like to go, but also a plan to get us there, and ways to work together to refine both the plan and the new system once we arrive in it. These new governance systems get us past the might makes right systems of the past, both the top-down legislation of taste and the bottom-up mob rule that we're currently dealing with everywhere. In terms of our social systems, in order to maintain integrity, it's important that we have solid authority and leadership. Of course, I'm starting out as the main leader in this project, but one of the first things I plan to do is to create affordable and accessible courses with accreditation, so that way other people can be initiated into leadership, and then further still be qualified to be able to critique ideas and offer upgrades to both the theory and how we work together. As a leader, I am active, available, and accessible. I'm not afraid of debates or public engagement and criticism. I welcome these things as ways to upgrade and improve what we're doing. I think it's important to have explicit standards and to maintain the integrity of our space and our project. Creating a healthy community around this project with no sexism and no racism and a space for people who are really at these stages of development to meet and feel comfortable together is so important. Having the courses and accreditation allows for a healthy hierarchy within the community. And eventually we'll have an open and transparent process to refine our ideas to upgrade and process tensions together. Not only is it important that we build this healthy community, that we empower individuals in it and we teach them the theory and teach them self-mastery and skillful, engaged practitioners in the world. Of course, as I've said, this extends further into movement and action, vision and transformation. And I think when it comes to aesthetics, this is much better production quality than what's offered in the other meta theory communities. You have a better free map. And eventually we'll also make some affordable merch and cool products available for you as well. Further, a lot of meta theorists have acted in a way that's kind of closeted and undercover. But I really want to see meta theorists in the world being out and bold and engaged, explicit, expressing our style, make our positions known. And when it comes to further upgrades, there's still a lot of room for improvement. And I don't personally claim to be the one with all the answers or to know everything. I know that a lot of the things that we're going to improve in the future are going to be based on conversations and engagement that we have together as a community. I've always said that I don't see myself as the leader, but as a leader who demonstrates the way and invites other people to join me on the path of leadership, because I don't think I can do it all by myself or alone. Your wisdom, your skill, and your leadership is definitely needed and welcome. Anybody who puts in the work can wear the crown. It's an elite to which all are invited. I think it's very important to create a ladder, so that way at the level of leadership we can have peers and work together. I think there's still lots of room for improvement. I think that when we study more about types and understanding what lines they prefer as they move through stages, there's still a lot that can be known about that. I think as we apply more quadratic zoom, we're going to get things like scale distinctions that start to emerge. Different meta-theoretical principles as different levels of scale relate to each other. I mentioned one earlier where you think you have a quadrant covered when really you're just looking at a smaller level quadrant within a different quadrant. There could also be principles about how you don't need to go further levels down past a certain point if you have answered your question at a higher level. But I'm sure there's going to be more things that we still discover as it relates to scale. I'm also very excited about further exploring modes and roles and the self-mastery practice. I think there's a lot of new things still to be discovered and expressed there. I have some ideas about how to lay the groundwork for that, but it's still going to be interesting to figure out what might emerge into the future. And of course, there's still lots of room for improvement as it relates to particular applications of the theory in different disciplines and future governance upgrades and things like that. Non-reductionism is just getting started, and we're currently just building the first draft of it together. Probably in 2 to 5 years, we'll upgrade the map and we'll continue to build upgrades together into the future. I know all that's a lot to digest, and I haven't really fully unpacked or explained a lot of it yet. I hope you can see the power and potential of a lot of these upgrades, and I hope you feel excited to dig in further and to engage and to see what more there is to learn and how we can grow together as a community. That being said, please like, share, and subscribe. Join the Non-Reductionist Facebook group. Introduce yourself and start some conversations there. Let's really build this community together. Also, I want to give a big thanks to my Patreons who support this content. Sal Humden, Kai Droshenberg, Michael Kubler, Jacqueline Elizabeth, and Steve Buss. These are our new Patreons. Please consider supporting on Patreon. It would mean a lot to me. I really want to be able to make these videos faster and do more, and your support really helps with that. You can become a Patreon, get your name on this list, and know that you're supporting something that's important. Thanks so much to everybody for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.